good morning and good afternoon to all our audience who watch us from different parts around the world. And welcome once again to this section of INISEG Cast created to analyze, discuss every single one of the political and social events that happen in society. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Ely Karmon. He's a senior research fellow at the Institut Policy and Strategy Interdisciplinary Center, EDC Israel, and a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, EDC. He fields research including international terrorism, WMD terrorism, political violence, and strategic influence of terrorism and subversion in the Middle East and worldwide. Has written extensively on international terrorism and has participated in numerous international conferences. He served as an advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Defense, is a member of the Atlantic Forum in Israel, and is involved in NATO workshop on terrorism and on the Mediterranean dialogue. So, Dr. Karmon, welcome to our channel. It's a pleasure for us to have you here today in INISEG Cast.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on your show.
You're welcome, our Dr. Karmon. So today we will discuss the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, the US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the security threats facing Israel. So I want to start with some important question for you, Dr. Karmon. And what is the geopolitical situation in the Middle East today, and what are the current security threats facing Israel?
If we speak about the geopolitical regional situation, it was always complex. It was always very difficult to analyze by experts because there are so many countries with so big differences and interests involved. But clearly, I'd say that since the Arab uprisings, what was called the Arab Spring in 2011, a lot has changed in the region and has impacted directly, first of all, the Arab countries, but also the other players in the region, the actors, could be those which think that they can be a hegemonic power. If we take as example Iran, Turkey, Egypt, or even Saudi Arabia, and the great powers also involved for centuries and really after the Second World War in the region. I would characterize the situation in the last years, especially since the civil war in Syria and partly in Iraq, that we have testified a trend of shifting alliances. Those which have analyzed, for instance, the Syrian war, with a multitude of players involved, not only the countries, the military of Syria, the military of the Islamic Guards of Iran, which were involved, Russia, a military raider, but in the front of the opposition forces, there were dozens of groups and organizations and tribes that everyone had its own interest, and this has produced a lot of fight who will influence the definition of this war, the civil war. And for many years, practically every 6-8 months, you see a change, a shift in the alliances, and you don't understand why this tribe or this region is allied with Qatar or is influenced by Qatar, and others are influenced by Iran or by Turkey. So this is one of the very important lessons that we've learned. We also have learned that the ethnic and tribal characteristics are very important, much more sometimes than the national or even international interest. So the fight for hegemony also has been one of these trends, because the Arab uprisings have weakened a lot of Arab countries, including Egypt, by the way, which was the second country which was involved in this huge earthquake, I would say political earthquake. And we remember that the President Mubarak and then all his government and regime has fallen. And so countries like Iran, like Turkey, or even Saudi Arabia have tried to influence the course of events and to become a kind of hegemonic element. And this has been expressed itself on the political level, but also on the military, economic, and financial level. Another issue which has influenced the situation is the fight between the great powers. The balance of power, which was quite, I would say, unchanged since the 50s or the 60s, or much more after the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1990, has changed because, I would say, the policies of United States maybe. We saw during the Obama administration, and much so with the Trump, and presently with the Biden administration, a change of the foreign policy in the Middle East, in the sense that the Middle East has become much less important for the American administrations, and the decision, what was called to pivot to Asia and China, seeing China as the main enemy and making all the effort on all the levels, political, economic, and military also, towards the Chinese influence, first of all in Asia clearly, but also globally. And this has influenced the other actors. And the Russians, which for many years were outside practically or neutralized, since the United States became one global power, the only one global power, have returned what was called the return of the peer. The Soviet Union, which was a great power, was very active in the Middle East since the 50s, the 60s, 70s, all the wars. It was practically influencing mainly radical Arab countries and had a huge military presence from Syria to Algeria and Libya. And this has disappeared some 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now, Russia is returned in force, first of all, by its military presence in Syria and its influence on the Syrian conflict, but also in countries like Libya, like Egypt, and even flirting with countries like the Gulf countries, the royal Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar. And third, the Chinese. Chinese influence has been mainly economic, because on the one hand, China needs very much the oil of, until today, by the way, the oil of the Middle East, but has also huge monetary reserve, financial reserves to support countries which are weak countries, and also to provide the military hardware. If the until lately the Chinese effort was mainly economical, we see more and more that they want also a military presence and strategic influence in the Middle East, for instance, by building bases in Djibouti, by trying to be active in conflict zone and sending forces even in the framework of the United Nations. So this is the new global balance of power, and it's only beginning to change, especially as you mentioned the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which had a huge impact, not only because it was a military withdrawal, but because the withdrawal was, I would say, very messed up, not organized, and it, I would say, it showed the weakness of the American military establishment and also the political leadership decision-making to manage the complex situation in Afghanistan, which led the United States to be seen as one of the weak players in the global arena.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Karmon. And you mentioned about some important thing about Iran.
Yes.
Once again, Iranian forces have given information about the development of the nuclear weapons of their territory. But in that case, do you think that the government of Israel will act directly to prevent this? Or what do you think are Israel's plans to prevent Iran's nuclear rearmament?
I think that looking to Iran, we must see two not different, but very related, important aspects of the Iranian strategy. One is the regional attempt to become a hegemonic power. Several years ago, 3-4 years ago, several Iranian politicians, members of parliaments have declared Iran is now controlling Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a, Yemen. So, meaning that the Iranian state is actually controlling parts, a very important part, including historical part of the Middle East and of the Arab world. And this indeed has materialized on the ground. The Iranian forces have fought in Syria since the beginning of the uprisings in order to support their ally, historical ally, by the way, since the 80s, President Bashar al-Assad and his regime. They have continued to support Hezbollah to strengthen their grip on the Lebanese state, have made every effort to subvert the stability of Iraq. And by the way, the Western presence there, including the American and the European and NATO presence there, in order to try to impose a kind of Shia predominance in an Iraqi state, which in the past was led by the Sunni minority. And in Yemen, supporting a tribal alliance of the Houthis, which have become practically a strong force against very strong armies of Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, and the other small Gulf countries. So they have achieved in this way not only a huge influence, but I would say the road to hegemony is open for the Iranians. The nuclear project is an old project, and it was opposed since the beginning, not only by Israel, but by the international community, by the Europeans and the Americans, and even the Russians, by the way. But it has become a part of this hegemonic attempt, because if Iran will achieve in the future nuclear capability, it is not saying that immediately they will use nuclear bombs against their enemies. But there are two very important threats. First of all, this will be a huge strategic umbrella for their hegemonic penetration in the region. We see already that they are very successful. They are not stopped even by the countries which are fighting them. For instance, not only Israel, but also the Gulf countries, Turkey even, and so on. But with a nuclear umbrella, this could give them a huge advantage against the other players. And this could provoke a very quick run to proliferation, because it is not acceptable for Turkey or for Egypt or even Jordan, we hear that they are trying to build a nuclear project, and Saudi Arabia. By the way, in the past, there was an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is a Sunni country with a nuclear capability. And one of the clauses of the agreement was that Saudi Arabia will finance the nuclear Pakistani project, and in case of need, the Saudis will receive nuclear weapons from Pakistan. Today, it is not clear if this is possible. So the Saudis think already for their own needs, and perhaps they will run to a bomb, as I said, like Turkey or Egypt, in case of the Iranian nuclear project being a success.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Karmon. You mentioned about Palestine, and Israel and Palestine have been fighting for more than 7 decades. What do you think that is the possible solution to this conflict, or what do you think that with the new Israel government the situation will improve or maybe worsen? Or what other opinion you think about the conflict between Israel and Palestine?
I would like to make some background historic comments. I was one of the experts or the academicians which supported the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement was an agreement between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the OLP, PLO, to try to give a state to the Palestinians. What happened is that after the beginning of the Palestinian Authority as a semi-independent authority, a proto-state, I would say, in near Israel, in the West Bank and Gaza, since the beginning, practically the Oslo Agreement was signed in September 93. In November 93, all of a sudden we see a huge wave of suicide bombings. So between 93 and the end of 2000, there were a huge amount of suicide attacks, and the civilian population in Israel did not accept that there is a negotiations for peace and a Palestinian state while there is a wave of such a kind of policy by the Palestinians. And by the way, this became even more violent with the second Intifada, beginning 2000, which the new leadership of the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat supported. And you see, in a period of 4 or 5 years, 2000, 2004, 2005, there are 1,000 Israeli civilians killed in such suicide attacks in the big cities in Israel, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and all the big cities in Israel. So clearly, from the point of view of the Israeli population, the Palestinians became enemy whom you cannot trust, because you give them independence or autonomy, and they are responding with this kind of violence. And this has brought a change in the political arena by the parties. The right-wing parties have become the main parties which governed Israel since the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. This to explain how the Israeli public has seen the Palestinian issue. When Israel left Gaza Strip under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, which died since, in 2005, we left in Gaza very important infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure, educational infrastructure. What happened 3 months after that, the Palestinians took control and destroyed all this infrastructure and transformed it in military camps. And the Hamas, which was already building its force in Gaza Strip, began to fire missiles, at that time very say primitive missiles, but firing missiles to Israel. Instead of transforming Gaza in a if you want, Singapore, they decided to destroy Israel, thinking that because this is the goal of Hamas and the other Islamist groups in the Palestinian Authority. Moreover, in 2007, the Hamas took control of Gaza Strip by a military coup, killing 200 members of the Palestinian security forces. And since then, you don't have any real relationship between the Gaza Strip under Hamas Islamist control and the Palestinian Authority under the Fatah secular party which controls the Palestinian Authority. I'll give you some examples. In 2005, Saudi Arabia gave the two players, Fatah and Hamas, $1 billion in order to achieve a peace agreement between the Palestinians. And it didn't work. And Hamas made this military coup. And the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, was almost killed in Gaza by a bombing near his house by Hamas. Since 2007, Abu Mazen has never visited Gaza Strip because he's afraid of being killed. And the Hamas is trying to subvert the Palestinian Authority. So you have actually today two entities. One is the Palestinian Authority, which is cooperating more or less with Israel, still has not normal, but has economic and even security relationship with Israel. And Hamas, which is trying to provoke, on the one hand, all the time Israel, by the way, supported by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a proxy of Iran, and the Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Those which think like me, that we have to achieve an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, and in the end to achieve hopefully a peace agreement. Understand very well that as long as there is no peace between Hamas and Fatah, and there is a war between them, an war of assassinations, of subversion, and so on, and that's why the elections which were planned for last May were cancelled, because the Palestinian Authority was afraid that Hamas will take control through subversion and through maneuvering the population. Even if you achieve with the Palestinian Authority some kind of agreement, it would not be implemented by the Hamas. In 2014, when there was the protective edge operation against Hamas by Israel, there was an agreement, ceasefire agreement, which was negotiated by Egypt, like the last one, which is, by the way, not yet a ceasefire. It's not an agreement, it's only a ceasefire. So the agreement said that the Palestinian Authority has to take control of the Gaza border, which was under Hamas, and then of the Gaza border to Israel, and then of the police force in Gaza. Nothing happened, because the Hamas did not accept, and the Palestinian Authority did not have the force or the will to do it. So what we can do under a new government, because the former government, which had a policy that I opposed, and other experts and people of the defense establishment opposed, was to keep Hamas in power, make some kind of longer-term agreements, financially especially, and humanitarian, but to permit Israeli settlers to build in the West Bank. The new government is a very complex coalition, but it has two advantages, I would say. One is that it cannot implement any annexation, because the differences between the players inside the coalition, the right wing and the left wing, and also it is constrained in much measure by the Abraham agreements. And this is one of the very important aspects of the Abraham agreements, because the paradigm that we cannot have peace or normalization with Arab countries as long as there is not a Palestinian state has been broken. There is a new paradigm. We can have normal relations, and this can help build little by little some better relations with the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. Because these countries also are not interested in letting Israel to go occupy all of Palestine and take all of Palestinians under their control. But they understand that there is a process in which the Palestinians have not delivered the goods from their part. And now the Palestinians have to decide, do they want to go the Hamas way or the more moderate way, not of Abu Mazen, because Abu Mazen is the chairman, is already too old. He is ideologically indebted to his fathers in the movement, as Yasser Arafat, but possibly those which will take power after the death or pass away of Abu Mazen, which, by the way, we don't know who will take control of Palestinian Authority. This is one of the very big questions.
Thank you, Dr. Karmon. About this important moment in Israel, Israel has one of the best intelligence services in the world, such as Mossad. But in this period where conflicts and threats to Israel are multiple, what do you think that is the current priority of this intelligence service, and what can you tell us about the main missions of the Mossad today?
Look, the Mossad is only one agency. It is there is a quite clear division of the work of the various intelligence agencies, and Mossad is responsible for intelligence abroad. But there is also the military intelligence, Amman, and the Shabak, which is the internal intelligence and security. It's their responsibility. And I would say even the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, like in other countries, has a branch which deals with the threats and has, I would say, diplomatic and political intelligence, okay? Therefore, what we call the intelligence community as a whole is involved in challenging the security and strategic threats to Israel, which come, I use the famous saying by General Charles de Gaulle of France, who, speaking of the nuclear force of France, said it is intended to be tout azimut, in all directions. Israeli state has to challenge threats from all directions, from north, from south, from the sea, and from the east, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran, and so on. So the success of the intelligence community in Israel is the fact that there is a close cooperation between the various agencies. There is a very quite clear definition of what every agency has to do, and rarely there is a conflict of interest. And I would say that one of the successes of our security forces in fighting suicide terrorism, which was, as I said, during 4 or 5 years, a huge challenge, was the very close, not intelligence, but also operational cooperation between the various agencies. When a pilot of an helicopter or a pilot of a drone is trying to reach a target in the Gaza Strip or in, say, in the sea, everybody has the same if you want, the same computer picture with all the information necessary from all the sources, and the decision practically is on the operational level, which says, okay, this is the intelligence that everyone has given me. We can decide now we can do targeting killing, for instance, like the Americans do, with minimum collateral damage, okay? Or we have to destroy an arsenal of missiles in Syria after we are sure that the Iranians are trying to build their a new, fabric for precise missiles and so on.
Perfect. I know that I changed a little the topic that we will talk right now, but as a senior research fellow of the Counter-Terrorism from the Institut Interdisciplinary Centers in Iran, and do you think that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan will lead to reorganization of terrorist groups with the intention to carry out terrorist attacks in the West again? And in your opinion, what should Western governments do to prevent such attacks that happen right now?
Okay, the Afghan, I spoke a little about it at the beginning. The American withdrawal from Afghan was a mess with huge strategic consequences. Strategic consequences because of the image of the American decision-making process on the one hand, and the military operational tools, okay? It was not a good example. In principle, the situation in Afghanistan should influence, first of all, directly the region of Afghanistan, which means not only Afghanistan, but also Pakistan, Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, China, and Iran, which are countries which are surrounding neighbors of Iran, of Afghanistan. There are ethnic groups of these countries inside Afghanistan, and Taliban is an Islamist force, which is a reactionary, I would say, it's considered a revolution, but it's a reactionary Islamist force. And we saw that all their promises to try to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan are not serious. The new government actually is formed only by the Pashtun leaders of the tribes of Pashtuns. There are no other ethnic groups like the Uzbeks, like the Hazaras, like the former government officials. And inside this establishment of Taliban, the Ministry of Defense is in the hands of the son of the Mullah Omar, which was the leader of the Taliban in the past during the war against the United States and all the situations that we know in the past of the Taliban. And the Minister of Interior is one of the leaders of these very extremist tribal groups, Haqqani. So how exactly the Taliban will moderate themselves and try to, by the way, according to many experts, there is also a foreign intervention and influence. The moderate, so-called moderate branch of the Taliban is under the influence of Qatar, because their leader, Badr, was in Qatar for 3 years, leading the negotiations with the Americans. He was previously in jail in Pakistan, and he was tortured by Pakistanis. So the other faction, which is the extremists, I will say, they were for all this period of time supported by the Pakistani intelligence. So you see already this kind of foreign influences inside Afghanistan. Then you have the big powers. The Russians and the Chinese decided to stay there. They have the embassies there. And look what happened to the Chinese. Chinese said, we have some kind of agreement, a promise by the Taliban leader that they will not permit the activity of the Uyghur Muslims against China. The last attack in Kunduz, in northern Afghanistan, several days ago, almost 250 people have been killed or wounded, was done by an Uyghur suicide bomber. Which was a member of the Islamic State, the Khorasan branch, okay? And therefore, we know that the infrastructure of Al-Qaeda and the infrastructure of the ISIS, which is called, as I said, IS Khorasan, are present and active in Afghanistan. So this is already a potential threat, first of all, as I said, for the countries around, and then for Europe and other parts of the world. The Russians are quite worried, by the way, and even Iran. We saw in Iran people in the establishment and clearly the population were opposed to the good relationship between the Iranian or Tehran government and the Taliban, because they said, look, they are killing and imprisoning the Hazaras, the Shiites. But the decision was to cooperate against the Americans and perhaps against the Chinese, okay, in Afghanistan. I don't know what will happen now after these attacks in Kunduz, if there will be some rethinking. All these powers, Russia, China, Iran, have their own worries, and Pakistan also has huge influence there. And this is opposed to India's interest in Afghanistan. India has supported economically and humanitarily for the last decade Afghanistan. Now Pakistan will use again the Taliban against India. So you see a fight between India and Pakistan on Afghani territory or outside Afghani territory, like in Kashmir. We have a wave already of immigrants from Afghanistan to Europe, to United States. For the moment, all of them, or almost all of them, are people which supported the West, which worked with Americans, worked with the European countries. But we don't know what will happen with the second generation, the young people, if like the Moroccans or the Algerians, which emigrated to France or to Belgium, or the Turks, which emigrated to Germany, became part of them, became radicalized, and they were recruited either by Al-Qaeda or by ISIS. And today there is a fight between ISIS and Al-Qaeda for the mind and hearts of these young people. In Europe, in Afghanistan, in Africa, because for the moment we see the most active groups are in Africa, where there is no real control. In the Sahel, in Central Africa, countries like Mozambique, like Burkina Faso, like Congo, Central Congo, never had such kind of activity of Islamists. Now they are active there, are fighting, Al-Qaeda fighting ISIS and vice versa. Europe has, for the moment, an advantage, because Europe has decided for the last years to stop the import, if you want, of these fighters, to return of these fighters from Syria and Iraq, and now from Afghanistan. And there is already a quite efficient way to stop this flow of returning fighters. But at the same time, there's a lot of work against radicalization. And our institute and other institutes are, as probably your institute, are involved in research how to prevent radicalization. And when there is radicalization, how the European authorities can de-radicalize. We believe more in prevention and de-radicalization is much more easier, I would say, effective to prevent radicalization than to de-radicalize people which were already fighters and involved in terrorist activity. So we have perhaps a respite of several years, but what happened in Afghanistan is not helping. It is not helping because we look to the declarations of all organizations, ISIS, by the way, and Hamas, and the groups which are pro-Turkish acting in Syria, the groups in, let's say, even right-wing groups have applauded the success of the Taliban or the victory of the Taliban, because this gives some backwind for them to try to be active on their own territory in the constituency that they are trying to convince to support them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Karmon. I have the last question for you, but not the less important. What final contribution do you give all our audience about your work?
You mean of our institutes?
Yeah.
I am working at my institute already for 25 years since its opening, and before that I was also teaching in Israel at Haifa University. I think that we see it, by the way, from the experience in our country and also worldwide. The security, intelligence, and military organizations are involved day by day in their fight against terrorism. And not only terrorism, but subversion, insurgency, and so on. So they are looking mostly to the tactical and operational level, because they have to stop somebody. They have to either to arrest him or to kill him, to dismantle the network of terrorists. We are looking more on the strategic level, and most of these institutes are working with open sources. Today, we need, but we don't use almost secret information. There's a huge amount of open information in many languages, and sometimes we say there is too much information. So you have to find the right information to use it in your analysis. But we are looking more for future trends and on the strategic level. And we know that many of these agencies, organizations are using our work because they are not able either practically, they don't have the time or the resources to do it. And then they are outsourced to various think tanks and institutes because this is our expertise. And we also are less influenced, I would say, generally, I don't know, because there are institutes which have a political agenda. Our institute is apolitical, and our researchers, everyone is independent. But in general, we prefer to be neutral in our analysis and to be as objective as we can. So not to serve a specific agenda of a specific government. And we are working, by the way, also abroad, because today, without international cooperation, for instance, the cooperation inside the European Union, Horizon 2020, and before the Horizon 2017 projects, we couldn't work without this international cooperation, what is called networking. My boss used to say, you need a network to beat a network of terrorists. Okay, so we are networking also, and my cooperation with your institute at this moment is one of these cases that we can explain what we consider to be the situation in this region or that region, what is the threat, and this exchange of experience and of evaluations helps advance our work.
Excellent words for all our audience. So we have reached the end of this incredible and interesting section of INISEG Cast, accompanied by a great leader and various issues international terrorists. So thank you, Dr. Karmon.
Thank you again for having me.